Okay, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much for joining me tonight. It's a little bit of an early stream. Usually I stream at about 8, but we're talking to someone on the other side of the world today, which I personally find to be like super exciting. I don't know about you, but you know, COVID obviously was a terrible thing, but there are some interesting things that I was sort of forced into doing and learning about, like, since it's happened, and like Zooming and the technology of bringing people together from all around the world is definitely one of them. So I'm pretty excited to have someone from the other side tonight. But before then, I've got to do my usual, and I have to try and push on you all the products I have coming up here in the future. And I do have a few. As we sort of have been talking about here on the channel for a few weeks now, we ended up canceling that actual play. It was kind of like an A-Team parody that we were going to do. We ended up canceling it. We rescheduled it. I had to cancel that again. And so now I've decided that I'm going to just sort of drop it on everyone as like a big surprise one of these days. So if you're interested in watching that, I've been sort of plotting and planning this one for a while. Please do hit the like and subscribe and the little bell. I think you ring a bell or something, and then like a representative from YouTube comes to your house and knocks on your door, I think, when I believe when a stream is about to start. That's what I've heard. I don't know if that's true. But if you do get that bell kind of a ringing, they'll let you know when I drop in with the surprise actual play. We do have a scheduled event actually coming up, and on this coming Monday, or I'm sorry, Tuesday, August 2nd, we're going to have the crew from D20 Tales. So this will be pretty much my largest number of people I've ever had in an interview before. I think my prior record was 3 people, but I realized, as I've sort of said before, that if I really want to interview 1,000 faces and retire, I'd better start sort of getting more people on the show at once so I could kind of consolidate before I have to, head off to the old folks' home. So they're going to be here on Tuesday at, I believe, at 8 p.m., but please do check your TV guide, or I should say your YouTube guide, to make sure that that is indeed true. So please do join us for that. They're a lot of fun, and as you know, I only have people on the program that I'm personally just very interested in, and I think have something really cool to deliver, and something I think that a lot of my viewers and students out there would enjoy. Last but not least, I don't want to make this go too long, otherwise I will incur the wrath of my mother, who doesn't like it when my monologues go on too long, and she wants me to get right to the guests. Last but not least, I have been very busy in the background. I've created for us a Discord server. So if you are interested in joining the Discord and meeting other people who are interested in learning about RPGs and talking about them, please do stop in and visit us. So the link is actually in the description below. And as always, you can follow me on Twitter at catwhowalks99 and Facebook at Myth and Legerdemain.com, which I think it's just called Facebook/Myth and Legerdemain. But anyway, the links are all in the description below. So again, Mom, relax. I'm getting to tonight's guest. I'm so sorry. Please don't text me. I know I go on for far too long. But as I was saying before, I'm excited to have someone from the other side of the world. So joining us, and he has actually reminded me of this, and I'd forgotten about it, joining us from the future. I mean, other streams, they bring you people that are in the present. I bring you people from the future. I mean, if that's not worth subscribing to, I don't know. I just don't know what is. I don't know. So please, hit the subscribe button. But at any rate, joining us from the future tonight, we have Cam Banks. And Cam is someone, what's interesting to me about Cam, and there was sort of a lull in my RPG interest time where I took about 10 to 15 years off, and I feel like he kind of rose during that time, and he was doing all this stuff that I would go to the bookstore, and I would see and say, oh, this is really cool, but I'm not into RPGs anymore. Or, oh, this is really neat, but I'm an adult. But here I am at 48 years old, soon to be 49 in another week or week and a half. And I, since I've gotten back into RPGs, I've been going back and grabbing a bunch of stuff that I missed out on. And I was so kind of surprised to see his name plastered all over it. And I had no idea. And then I did an interview with Matt Forbeck like a few months ago, and he mentioned Cam, and I was like, oh yeah, that's that name. And so I thought, my goodness, I should just have him on the program. So tonight, without further ado, Mom, here he is. We have Cam Banks. Cam, thank you, first of all, for sitting through my soliloquy there. I appreciate it. And second of all, thank you for joining us from the future. Can you tell us what time and date it is there?
Yeah, it is Tuesday. Let's see. Oh, the day after you. I'm losing track of the time. It is 10:14 in the morning. So it's an early morning here, Tuesday. Uh, Completely opposite time, obviously, from you folks there. But no, I was asked earlier today with someone else, in fact, asked me the same question. They said, what's the future like? How's it going? I said, like, I'd love to tell people, but when I do, they don't believe me, and then it's too late by the time they get through it. So,
All I
yeah.
want to know are what horses to bet on. That's it. Just tell me,
Yeah.
just one name. Can you give me one name? Like, I don't know.
When I was living back in the US at 2000, when the Y2K thing was all the rage, everyone was talking about worrying about that. The clocks were going to go over and all the computers were going to turn off. We were at Disney World in Florida and staying there for the New Year's celebration. And I called my dad early on the 31st and said, okay, because I knew he was ahead of us by something like 20 hours. And I said, is everything working still? You know, is what happened because they obviously went to Y2K, they went to 2000 before us.
Yeah.
The clock was over. It's like, yeah, everything's fine. So I just told everybody that I was with, we're fine, don't worry. Let's just go enjoy the Disney World. It's not going to be a problem. So there are advantages sometimes to having these connections here in the
Yeah,
future.
you get a little early warning. I remember when I was living in Japan, I, I remember when I was living in Japan, I would tell my students that my parents were living 17 something hours behind or something, and
Hmm.
they would just be completely confused, and I could see the gears in their heads kind of turning as they tried to figure this out. And I would just recall when I was that age, and I literally thought these things, and I'd be like, how does space warp and how does time just twist like that? Well, at any rate, thank you so much for joining us. I was hoping, speaking of kids, as I sort of brought up, I was wondering, have you always been the creative fellow that I have discovered you to be? So during those whatever years it was, I feel like I could just go to any old like book and your name would be on it. And there were some products you were sort of specifically related to. I found you to be kind of related to at any rate. But were you as creative as that and as productive as that when you were a little one?
Yeah, probably from the age of like 10 or 11 onwards, getting into RPGs was a huge time sink for me. Lots of time spent making things, making my own games, making adventures, all that sort of stuff. And my friends and I, we kind of formed a kind of a small group of budding homebrew type people. So we would, if a new game came out, we would play it straight for maybe sort of 2 sessions, and then we would just house rule the heck out of it. So, yeah, I've always been into that. Even before RPGs, though, I was making my own comics. I was making my own, scripts for TV shows that didn't exist. My mother was alarmed at this enormous number of artworks that I was making around Star Wars back in about 1977. I had not seen the movie yet. All I'd seen was posters, right? I hadn't seen anything about it, didn't know what was going on. But I was making my own droids and saying, this is this character, this is this character. And she said, what has happened? This was a huge creative boost. So I kind of blame Lucasfilm in a way for that, um, really bringing me out of my shell and into the world of just doing stuff. But that was, what, 6, 7 years old? So yeah, most of my life.
What was it about? So if you're if you're gonna, let's drill down on this. What was it about Star Wars that kind of? I know. Let's get really deep here. I'm just think of me
Hmm.
as your therapist here. What was it about Star Wars that? I mean, even before you saw it, if you're just looking at posters and things like that, I was kind of the
Hmm.
same way. I'm a couple years, I think, younger than you are, but
Yeah.
it was just posters that I mostly saw at first. What captured your imagination?
Well, obviously, this is long before anything like the internet, and we didn't have the kind of saturation of media stuff. So there wasn't a lot other than books. And I think that I was at the age that I was becoming more aware of things like, stories and fantasy and science fiction and things. That there was prior to that not a lot of that really going along in my life. I don't think I was exposed to much of it. But because it was a cultural phenomenon at the time, and this is probably actually more like 1978, to be honest. New
Mm.
Zealand takes in those days things took a little longer to get into our part of the world. Um, I think that was the appeal of something that was so different, so interesting and strange. I want to say that maybe Doctor Who was a little bit before that, right? Because it was on TV, but it was so scary, and I didn't know what anything was going on. So that didn't hit me with the same kind of sort of creative energy that maybe Star Wars did. Because wow, these people with laser swords and there's these robots and there's like spaceships. It's so cool, right? And that was really, I guess, the heart of it. It wakes something in you that you feel like you can do something fun and different and just make up things because they clearly did. I don't know. There was no laser swords and robots and spaceships in real life. So if someone else can make these things that look so cool, why can't I do
Do you think, and this is something I was kind of curious about, because about that age too, for myself, I got into a character by the name of Ultraman,
it?
which
Hmm.
I probably, so obviously but there was something interesting about it. Wasn't just say the difference in like, or the robot, or well, Ultraman was a person that was kind of like a robot, but anyway, it wasn't so much the story, but it was also the cultural differences that sort of arose from the science fiction adventures and whatnot. This might be a silly, stupid American person question, but was there was there a flavor to Star Wars that might have been different than like what science fiction from New Zealand was like at the time, or?
Well, it's a British colony, or was, right? And
Mhm.
so, or dependency, and there's a lot of that British sci-fi that had always been present in New Zealand, along with anything else that came from other parts of the world. I think Star Wars is unique in that way because it had a lot of British actors in it. There's a lot of accents that
Mm.
weren't American. It didn't feel like an American thing. It felt like a global thing, at least in terms of, English speaking global. So there wasn't like a vibe. This is what American sci-fi is like
Mm.
versus, Doctor Who. Star Trek for me felt more like an American thing.
Mm.
Yeah, it had more American sort of feels. Everyone in that show seemed to talk with a American accent, so that was
Mm.
different. But no, like you got Alec Guinness, you have a lot of other characters. People weren't. Uh, um, gosh, why am I spacing on his name? Grand Moff Tarkin. So all these
Peter Cushing.
characters who Peter Cushing, yeah, you got a variety of people and variety of voices and sort of like mannerisms that didn't feel pigeonholed to any one specific kind of part of the world. So yeah, I think that's the big difference, right? You've got those things which sound familiar, but then you have the stuff in it that's strange and different and exotic and cool. It's not in your own experience up to that point.
Yeah, yeah, I can understand what you mean. Um, how about what? So you mentioned kind of like you were doing a lot of drawing at that
Hmm.
age. Um, did the drawing? I mean, did you continue with the drawing? Did you set and the interesting thing is you also said TV or film scripts as well. Did you sort of know that you were creating scripts? Did you know like you were sort of destined for some sort of visual storytelling kind of medium? Did you know? Were you aware of what you were doing?
I don't know about awareness, but it was of interest, right? I mean, it was fun to talk about, how do you write for television and movies and things. Obviously, there's some kind of script. There's the people say things and you write them out. I was an avid reader of Target books, put out all the Doctor Who serializations as novels, at the time, and I would chew through those at school when I was, 8, 9, 10 years old. And much to the consternation of my teachers, who would rather I read other things that were not Doctor Who books.
Right.
But um, I think there's this idea later on in life when because I continued to be an artist all the way through. I did art in high school and so on. But the idea of sketching and drawing has always been a fun sort of way to kind of express not just text and words, but also the visual medium, right? So I would do illustrations of my players' characters for D&D. I would make, if we were playing Marvel superheroes at the time when we were in high school, I would draw the superheroes that they had made up, right? And they would use them for their character sheets. So I was always like, I need to see this. It's in my head. I want to put it down on paper. And I think that's kind of the genesis of all that.
What was it then that you wanted to do when you grew up? Was there something in particular you were thinking, or was there a way you imagined yourself, or something you were chasing after?
First time anyone asked me that question, I said I want to be a scientist, and I don't know why that was true. I don't think it was because I had a huge love of science. I think it was because it felt to me like learning cool things about the world, right?
Yeah.
And as it turned out, I was pretty average at science in school, so that wasn't really going to happen. I pivoted a lot towards English and liberal arts stuff in high school instead, and so history and English and social studies and all those sorts of subjects were much more my bag, and so I think I kind of went away from there. When I went to university, I knew that I wanted to be a modern Indiana Jones, which is a silly thing to try and think, because I wasn't doing this stuff. It wasn't the adventure side of things that I liked. It was the anthropological, the archaeological, or the history, and finding things out about how the world works and what the past will teach us. And so I did history, and I also did psychology and philosophy to sort of really just grasp what the meaning of everything was. So yeah, definitely not the same as science, but I think even then, science was trying to sort of come out for me as a way to sort of explain, I want to know things. And so later on, definitely found a way to sort of pursue that without having to worry about, I don't know, figuring out how physics works, which was
Right.
Chemistry, pain in the neck.
Yeah. Is that something that you pursued after school then, or did you sort of leap right into the gaming scene?
I found as I went through university and became more familiar with the things that I was good at, that counseling and therapy and things were my strong points. And so I really did nail down that, and I wanted to become a mediator or dispute resolution sort of person. I was quite shocked at the end of my university degree when my advisor said, you've done very, very well, Cam. This is great. Exceptionally good. You've got all the sort of skills you need. You can't do this for a living right now. You're too young and you're too empathic. So find something else to do.
Oh, so wait, can I ask? So you're too young and too empathic. So the meaning behind that is you're too young to have the experience to counsel people, and you're so empathic you're going to end up hurting yourself, becoming emotionally distraught from listening to and trying to help people with their problems.
Yeah, I would take the work home with me, is what he said, is the way he framed it, which was,
Right.
I think, a very interesting way. Hadn't learned enough maturity at the point of my life that I was at to sort of wall off the sort of experience of being helpful to someone with internalizing it somehow as being responsible for them, right? It's a huge lesson that a lot of people don't even learn when they're much older in life. It's a big deal. I felt that wasn't true, but he was a better judge of my own character than I was at the time. So I went into supervision works, retail management, and managing and supervising and all that sort of stuff. That seemed to be kind of like my niche for quite a long time, and I still to this day I supervise teams and manage groups, but that was also a way to bring in some of the skill set that I had from helping people and listening to them and sort of figuring out how to get things to work, especially interpersonal, inter-colleague relationships and things. That's still a part of what I do.
Do you ever think and wonder? I wonder what it would have been like if I had pursued that, or if I had taken some time to see the world and then gone back to it. Or are you kind of like, I'm so happy doing what I'm doing now, you don't even look back?
Oh, I love doing what I do now, right? But yeah, I do often think about what would it have been like if there had been therapist cam as opposed to game designer cam. Sure. Um, I think I would have had to be a lot harder, harden myself up a bit.
So then, in that respect, maybe you sort of agree with the advice that you had gotten, or do you feel like you would have been smart enough to sort of work your way through it and figure it out? And
Well, I mean, I think right now I could go back to it now and take it up if I wanted to, right? If I felt that this current career of mine wasn't working out, I
it's
would go
working
back and
out
get.
pretty good, I
Yeah,
gotta say. Yeah.
it's fun. I like doing it. I think that if I was to go back, I would need to get accreditation and other kinds of things. You
Right.
can't just go in saying, "Yeah, I did a bachelor's degree in this. I should be becoming a therapist now." Right.
So then, when were you first kind of exposed to RPGs? You mentioned, of course, you're playing Marvel superheroes in high school. Was that one of your first games, or were you playing D&D before
No,
that?
no,
Or
like yeah, 10 or 11 years old, D&D with my mates. The red box D&D, Elmore cover. But before that, there was the Moldvay one, which was being passed around by my friends. That was the red box prior to the one that became a huge hit, right? And it's still to this day people go back and say that Tom Moldvay's version of the basic set was the best, and whatever. But they don't understand what it's like when you're a kid, that you don't honestly think about that kind of stuff. It's whatever's the new version is the one you want to get, right? So we were all into the Frank Mentz's red box with the dragon on the front cover and the fighter and all that sort of thing. So we played a heck of a lot of D&D. TSR at the time was putting out other games, Star Frontiers and Top Secret, and we sort of
that's right.
got those. Nothing ever really sort of rose to the level of D&D until Marvel Superheroes came out. So that was sort of later on. We just jumped all the way into that.
What
Such a
what
great
was
game.
it that grabbed you? What was it that made you put that down and just go immediately to that?
Oh, it's comic books. I've always loved comic books. So, superheroes are my favorite thing. So, I had seen ads for it in Dragon magazine. They had the ad and they said on the back cover or the front cover somewhere, here's a version of this character, and you're like, wow, how does it work? What are the rules? And it's got things like incredible and amazing and fantastic.
Yeah.
That's really neat. Uh, I want to play this guy. I want to be a superhero, because the superhero games we'd had to that point were more complex, or they just didn't fit our play style. It wasn't. We weren't into champions. We tried playing villains and vigilantes, and that didn't really go too far because it was lots of maths. Um, and the appeal of something like the original Marvel superheroes is, hey, here's my character. I know what this works. I've got a chart I can roll on.
Right.
Let's do it.
Right. And just to sort of take a slight diversion here, what comics were you reading at the time, and what ones were like really influential to you?
My earliest memory of comics, I used to go to the used bookstore with my mother. She would go and buy used romances. She'd trade in. This is a swap type situation. She'd bring in books and then they'd switch them out. And I would bring in a pile of comics and I'll switch out for more comics. And they were all over the place. They were pretty much, there was no order, sequential thing. It was like, oh, this comic's got Jimmy Olsen doing this weird thing with Superman. A lot of it was early Silver Age DC stuff that had been reprinted in Australia, black and white, into big, thick books. So I would read those. And once again, they didn't really seem to follow any order. Like I would read like issues like 1950 and 72 or something.
Right.
I had my first experience of Marvel comics, probably wasn't Spider-Man, it was Iron Man. I think was my first Marvel comic that I read. But as I got older, I learned about subscriptions, and so I asked my parents, I want to subscribe to a comic. And I was really into Micronauts. I don't know if you remember
Yes,
Micronauts.
absolutely. Bill Mantlo was, I think, the writer, wasn't he?
Yep. Micronaut, the toy, I always was already a fan of, because I got a huge sort of Micronauts Christmas swag one year, and I was just into the little dudes. And I saw that there was a comic book about it, so I wanted to subscribe. So I had a subscription to Micronauts, which arrived all the way from the US, rolled up in a tube, delivered, and it was great. That was my first sort of subscription thing, and I guess it all just took off from there. I would go out and collect comics and read more stuff.
What was it about Micronauts in particular that kind of caught your attention? Like, because I remember, like, I have a few issues of it, and I always thought there was something kind of weird about the story. And it was, as I got older, I kind of look back on it, and when I was that age, I wasn't really thinking about who the writers were. But then I thought, oh, this is Bill Mantlo. And I started making connections with like other, like I think Rocket Raccoon was the big one from him, and others.
Yep.
Was there anything about Micronauts in particular that you enjoyed?
It had a mix of superheroes, sci-fi. It was had a lot of big, heavy concepts like the idea of multiverses and
Yeah.
shrinking and all that kind of thing. For a long period of time, it was just little micro-sized dudes running around the Marvel universe and interacting with a sort of Marvel heroes. My first introduction to the X-Men was because of Micronauts, because there was an issue where they went to the X-Men mansion and met Nightcrawler, who I didn't know who that was. Like, oh, who's Nightcrawler? So yeah, it's interesting because it was like a gateway into the rest of the Marvel universe for me, having played with the toys and when they know more about the toys lore was, and then the comic book kind of just opened it up.
So at that time when you were running game, or I guess that's what I'm going to ask, were you running games or were you a player in the game, or were you kind of going back and forth?
We would trade off. I was a player to begin with because my friends bought the game and they were if you owned it, you ran it. That was the sort of the story, right? And I was keen to become a dungeon master myself, so I asked my parents to get the red box for me for Christmas, and that's when I got that, or birthday, forget which. But we would trade off, and then, we would make a dungeon, and then someone else would run it for you, and back and forth. So, but for Marvel superheroes, I was the one who ran that, so there was no other player, no other GM for that than me, and that was because first of all, I bought it, but also my knowledge of Marvel was so exhaustive at the time, my friends couldn't keep up, right? So they were like, "You should run this." We didn't know.
And so what for you, what was it like coming up with those games when you were younger? Like if the adult Cam looks back on the young Cam, how would he like evaluate his GMing skills? What was it that was not I don't mean from a critique, but I just mean like what was driving him to run those stories?
I would come up with enormously long kinds of like, here's what's happening in the rest of the world, sort of like updates for myself. I remember back in the day, in the back of the comic book, you'd read this one section that says, "Here's the other stuff that's out this month," and it would give a small little like 1 or 2 sentence summary of what was going on in Werewolf by Night and X-Men and Moon Knight and Avengers, and you say, okay, well, this is happening. Like, the return of Ultron, and it would just say something like that. I would make those for each month that we were playing and have that sort of world building around me while I ran the game. So if I wanted to know, where a character was, I had already put them into some other person's book, essentially, and then I could sort of connect them. So I think looking back now, I think there's a lot of world building that I was doing, a lot of sort of trying to establish that narrative that was playing along with our own game, but also so much stuff was being done at the table to try and connect things together. Like if we wanted to play a module that had come out, I would work to make it work into this sort of campaign we were playing, which was, it's a skill that you have to develop too, I think, to use published stuff with your own stuff. Just figure out how to slot that in somewhere.
It sounds a lot like, yeah, it sounds like you're doing your game design. It sounds destined in a way. Like it just sounds like you're doing all of that stuff very naturally as a kid. And I can see how you would, maybe think to alternate versions of yourself, but be very, very happy with where you are. Back then, what made a good gaming experience for you, and what makes a good gaming experience for you now? Are you still the person that's running? Are you playing a lot? Do you not have much time because you're doing so much just with the design?
It comes and goes. I mean, right now I am not running games. I run a D&D game for some friends online every my Sunday, their Saturday, and that's fun because I'm teaching them how to play, and it's been really good to sort of see these people experience RPGs for the first time. They specifically asked to learn D&D, so that's why we're doing that. And I like 5e quite a lot, so it's fun. but I had told I have two game groups. One meets twice a month and one meets every Monday night. And I told them I'm done running games right now because I was getting uh, stressed out preparing for them, anxious about the game coming up. Um, because the work was a lot of stuff going on at work, and just like the whole idea of trying to make things work properly and sort of self-evaluating myself after a session, thinking it didn't go very well. Um, and when you're a GM, sometimes you really do set way higher expectations for it
Yeah.
than your players care about. They would tell me that they're just there to have a good time, but I would sort of read into the outcome of what had happened and think, oh, I don't think that this one player liked it much tonight, or I don't think this person was really feeling the vibe. They keep changing their characters. I have to help them out. And so eventually I said, look, this is a lot of stress for me. I love running games. I love
Mm.
preparing them. I love sort of working on things, but let's I'll just take a hiatus. I'm more keen to play. And so I think I've been enjoying that for the past 6 months or so.
It's interesting because I think, I've been kind of isolated for the last few years because of COVID, and I had actually just moved here. I'm currently in Boston, in Cambridge, and so I've been playing mostly online. And I had sort of like you, I see when I go online, I see a lot of people, game masters that are rather stressed out, and they're sort of
Hmm.
like self-reflecting, and they think about, my goodness, well, I don't know if I ran it as well, or maybe this one player, I could have used their character more, I could have come up with a different hook. I feel
Yeah.
like it's very much a double-edged sword. Like, that on the one hand makes a person a very good game master because they're very attentive to everyone at the table, and they're trying their best. Whether or not it works, that's a different thing, but they are trying. But on the other hand, they can sometimes be too hard on themselves about it, or it just can be exhaustive.
Yeah.
So, oh,
No, well, just a total agreement. I think we're always our hardest critics, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and
And I often prefer people to be a little bit self-aware about what they can and can't do, and sort of like work on that so they can sort of do better, or try, for that. But I feel sometimes ignorance might be bliss, when it comes to that. If you just don't know how bad the session is, but you just keep running it, at least you don't
yeah.
feel so.
Well, it reminds me of, I think that's right, and I hadn't made this connection until you mentioned that, but it reminds me of like the advice that a lot of professional writers give to writers that are attempting to begin writing, and they say, well, when you begin writing, you turn off your inner editor and you just
Mhm.
write everything. And you don't tell yourself this is crap, this is terrible. You don't look back. You just I mean, you try to keep it together, but you don't look
Yeah.
back and overly harsh on yourself. And then after that's done, you look at the pile of paper you have and you say, that's great. Now I'm going to go back and make it even better.
Hmm.
And I think it's interesting. I hadn't made that connection until you sort of mentioned, like, basically just like running it and just having fun and not worrying about it and then thinking about it later. So has your game mastering and or designing style, or your approach to games in general, do you feel it's kind of evolved since those days when you were playing Marvel superheroes to now? Have your tastes changed, or your methods or approaches?
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Speaking with lots of folks our age, I think that there's definitely a lot of people who sort of like had already set up and established what their preferences were when they were in their 20s, and that they haven't changed since then because it works for them.
Hmm.
I think for me, probably because I'm in this line of work and designing things, and always being aware of what's currently coming out, who's working on what the trends are for RPGs and design, and sort of what rules are being used now versus what they used to be. My own work has been influenced by that same thing. I feel that in terms of an RPG designer, I would say I'm one of those sort of the progressive type, not necessarily politically speaking, but progressive in
Hmm.
terms of I want to sort of build on what's come before
Hmm.
and make new stuff. I love to go back and rehash things. I like to bring out new editions of things.
Hmm.
I love converting from one to something else. That's always fun to me. As a personal hobby thing, for a while, when I didn't have a game group, I was constantly converting the first edition Dragonlance modules to different games, Star Wars, RuneQuest, all sorts of things, Shadowrun. And eventually, when third edition came out, that's kind of why I got into the publishing thing, the professional stuff. Anyway, I immediately went to Dragonlance and did conversions for the old edition into the new one. That's the kind of thing that I find interesting, right? And I don't believe that I could stick around in the way that I played games back in the the 80s and 90s if I was doing that. I think if I didn't have this as a job and I wasn't interested in other things and I was just interested mostly in my local game group and having a good time playing, I could have still stuck with, whatever game for as long as I wanted to until someone told us that they were bored with it.
And it's interesting, though, that you mentioned the conversions and things like that. In my mind, I mean, I don't know because you're the pro in this area, but that sounds like a lot of the math that you were talking about you didn't necessarily like back in school. Was there something different about this math that you were doing, or was it a different kind of math, or am I sort of missing what it would be like to convert stuff?
I feel there might be a part of the brain that can handle things like computer programming and object-oriented learning and things like that, where you have structure and process and components and modules and things that sort of come together to produce an output, right? Different from, I guess even if I cared enough about the outcome and the situation for things like chemistry and physics, I could probably just tackle it. But I don't think I had the motivation. So just the raw math of it doesn't interest me, but the process as a tool to get something you want does. And so if you figure out, okay, so in order to do this thing, I'm going to have to convert these 8 numbers to these 12 numbers because it's the, whatever, this part of the character sheet must become this kind of thing. Is there a complete correlation, or do I completely reinvent the two of them? That all seems fine to me. But if someone said, hey, completely out of context, do you want to convert these 5 numbers to these 12 numbers? I'm like, I don't really want to do that. Why would I want to do that?
Right. It's actually it's what it's for, and it's kind of like the texture around it and all of that. Because
totally,
you can kind of see what you're doing, and you're getting a result that is satisfying, and you're going to be able to like use for or someone else even is going to be able to use. You mentioned that you were doing. You sort of mentioned that you were doing conversions of Dragonlance stuff from one system to another. How did you first kind of gain the attention of a publisher and get your first gig or your first job? Was it related to that at Dragon Magazine? Or?
Yeah, that was it. I was working as a temp at AccuWeather. AccuWeather, I won't go into any commentary about what I think of that company, but I think that at the time I was temping for them, there was a lot of downtime that you could just sit at the computer and do nothing but just wait for something else to come along. And both there and at home, I was working on sort of conversions for this new 3rd edition game. There was it wasn't Usenet, I guess it was an email list, which was fans of Dragonlance who were working on this sort of conversion, unofficial conversion to 3rd edition. So I would sign up for that and join in and post it. Like what's probably a Yahoo group, right?
Yeah.
And the people in charge of it had actually been recognized by Margaret Weiss and her company at the time and said, and Tracy Hickman, let's get these people to be the official Wizards of the Coast recognized fan group who are doing fan conversions of it. So they did the same thing with Birthright, the same thing with Dark Sun. There were people who were doing different D&D settings, and Wizards said, this is the official fan group. This is the people who we think are fans. If you want to be in on the fan stuff, join up with them. That way they can keep track of us and make sure we're not doing anything terrible.
Right.
So we had that set up, and then Margaret said she got the license to do Dragonlance from Wizards, the official licensed product, and so she tapped all of us to do that. And initially it was all volunteer stuff. We just sort of helped out. We were brainstorming things. We would share our stuff to the group, and I think we spent like 4 weeks talking about converting languages over it. It was mind-numbingly boring. I don't know why we spent so much time doing it, but when it came to things like classes and races and things, that was like, okay, I'm on board with this. But I got a writer's gig, a contributor's gig for the books, and then not long after that, I guess they'd like my work habits and my content that I was making for them, and they said we want to have you do some work on the Age of Mortals book, which was the first
Hmm.
official supplement that came out for Dragonlance in third edition. So I did work on that, and they paid money. That's great, you know, cool. And then, oh, you did such a good job of this. We want to do a monster book, and we're going to have you and this other guy
Right.
do that.
That was your
And that
first
was my
big
first,
one, right?
yeah, big cover credit. And I was like, whoa, that's incredible. So that was really quite something.
At that time, were you in New Zealand or were you in the U.S. or where?
I was in Pennsylvania. Yeah. So I was living in the US from 96 to 2018.
Ah,
So I
okay.
was, yeah. Mhm.
I see. I see. It's interesting. So, were you more in contact then with Margaret Weiss's on the Margaret Weiss side or on the Wizards side of it? I guess.
The Margaret side, because she was very much a supporter of the fans and the fan community. And so, she would advocate for us to Wizard and say, these are the people who are writing for us, and this is what's going to happen. And, she didn't do a lot of the writing. She was busy doing books. She's writing novels at the time. So she couldn't sort of like, oh, ignore the actual
Right.
huge paying business of writing novels and do this. So she had her company, hire freelancers to do that. It was really rewarding period of time because there was a lot of collaboration, tons of just chatting over emails every day about Dragonlance. Just, you can't beat it.
So you had been so essentially you kind of started as a fan, and
Hmm.
you turned your gig into working for the company or the property or the universe, the setting that you were just doing for free and for fun anyway.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, you're like this. I think was it Steven Sansweet on the Star Wars side that was eventually hired to do that. Like he had some online encyclopedia or something, and they're like, "Why don't we just buy this and you can come do it? You can become our archivist or something." What?
Yeah. A similar thing. I mean, it's always nice when there's someone can say, first of all, you seem to know a lot about this, and also you do
Yeah.
a pretty good job at writing up for it, and also you're a fan, so why don't we just have you do it? So yeah.
What was it about the Dragonlance setting and universe and all of that that sort of caught your attention? And maybe what got you? Did you read that like initial trilogy and all of that, like Dragons of Autumn Twilight and all of those, and take it from there, or did you get in late, or how did that happen?
No, absolutely. When it came out, Dragons of Autumn Twilight, and Dragons of Despair, the first module that came out in 1983. 1984, not too long after it, was the first novel. So yeah, here's like 13-year-old Cam, like just in beginning high school, as a freshman, essentially, just like playing D&D all the time. Oh my gosh, now there's a book about it. Like there's an actual thing, and is it any good? And we'll trade the same one around so people would read it, right? A friend of mine spoiled like two things out of it. The big spoil. I was like, oh my gosh, why did you tell me that? Got so mad. But no, we were really into that, right? And playing the modules and things. I think it was later on, though, maybe 6 or 7 years later, we actually played the whole campaign properly in second edition because they had put out like the three books that were like the new versions of that for second edition. They were really badly converted. There's a lot of stuff they didn't even convert at all very easily. They left out a lot of stuff from they missed. I think in the first book they didn't even have Raceland's spell book. Like there was just stuff that we were like,
Right,
what?
really obvious. Yeah.
Yeah, but we played it anyway, and I think I was not the DM for that. It was my friend who ran that, and I have such fond memories of that experience. The early high school sort of getting into the sort of fandom at the ground level sort of stuff that it was probably the most um, uh, you know favorite thing about D&D that I had gone through. Other than like making up our own stuff, which was always just like off the cuff. And it's funny because looking back, if you think about what D&D at its heart is, and a lot of people have talked about this recently because the movie is coming out, this new movie, and oh my gosh, this movie is no good because of X, Y, and Z, and then everyone's like, oh no, but look, it's got gelatinous cubes in it, it's got owl bears and mimics. The thing that came up was that D&D's always been kind of like a bunch of thieves and looters and doing kind of heists and capers, and it's goofy and everything else. And I'm like, yeah, but up until a point. And then at one point, for a long time, Dragonlance took over, right? It wasn't
Yeah,
like that. That was a very much a sort of a romantic fantasy, a sort of high epic war thing, more on the vein of Lord of the Rings.
yeah,
Whereas prior to that, much more Fritz Lieber, Fafhrd and the Grey Mouse
yeah.
kind of thing. And yeah. So I think there are people who look back and feel that D&D has returned to that kind of like the roots of where it was, right? Both in old school communities, but also even in people playing 5e, having a good time, lighthearted. And there's a lot of Dragonlance sort of fans who are like, you left us alone, and when we're playing serious RPGs here. And I'm like,
Mm.
well, kind of serious. You had Kinder in it, so Gully Dwarves, but I definitely feel that that was sort of like what was left its mark on me. It was less the goofy stuff and more of this sort of like feeling of epic um, continuity. So when I got to the point of actually writing for things, that was the one I went to. I didn't go to anything else. I wasn't into Great Hawk. I wasn't into Forgotten Realms. It was more about Dragonlance's sort of storyline.
What's interesting to me about Dragonlance is that it starts as a game and becomes a series of novels.
Mhm.
And traditionally, whenever things like, I mean, this is almost a cliche to say this, but traditionally when you get a game, whether it be a video game, a board game, whatever it is, role-playing game, converted into a story, and it fails. Why do you think
Yeah.
that Dragonlance? Because you know what's funny is I didn't know that when I was a kid and reading Dragonlance, I didn't know that it was a game before it was a series of books. And
Yeah.
and the adult me now, and I have to admit, I have to be honest, I'm also an English teacher. I'm like, oh, okay, it's a book based on a game. I'm sure this will be great. The adult me would probably not give it a, well, I might, because I'm a teacher, might give it a chance, but I would be cynical.
Hmm.
The
Yeah.
young me, when I see those books, I saw textured, woven, like you're saying, epics with like real like bite and real story in them. Why do you think what happened with Dragonlance that went so well, and why did it do so well when so many other properties like games get turned into books or movies or whatever, they kind of just yeah.
I think that Tracy had come up with a larger picture sort of storyline plot and sort of a series of events that sort of like made it easier to translate into something like a novel series. It was obviously modules they put out in sequence, and each of them had their own thing in it. Um, his original goal was I want to use each one of the different dragons in D&D. There's the first one's going to have a black dragon, the second one has a red one, there's a brass dragon comes into the third one, and so on, right? And we'll do it as many modules as it takes to have that happen. Plus, also there's a story of this war. It's in three parts because Act One, Act Two, Act Three. The myth that's out there is that the whole thing was played through and that the books were kind of like Tracy Hickman's campaign, right?
Mm-hmm.
When actually he just ran one adventure. What he played ran Dragons of Despair, the first module for his fellow co-workers and some friends, and a lot of the characterization of the characters came out of that for the books, right? But that's the end of it. He didn't run all of the modules. They didn't just sort of transcribe it into this thing. That was almost all of that was just Margaret and Tracy writing up the story that came out of what was given there as the sort of the plot of the modules.
Mm-hmm. So there was a higher. It sounds like they were creating complex and textured stories as opposed to like just sort of simple. Well, I don't want to say simple because there is an artistry to it as well, but they were doing something a little bit more narrative driven and that grew and changed with over time, I guess, to create like that flow in a book.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting because I read them through high school, and I wasn't like a big. It was actually a buddy of mine who was really into them, and he kind of got me into a few of them. And I had actually, what's funny is I got into their other the Deathgate cycle, I think it was called.
Right.
I
Yep.
really got into that, like especially like the first couple books. I love those first couple books, and I think it was Fire Sea was maybe the first one, or maybe I'm wrong.
Hmm.
But I love those stories, and I could tell like they were bringing a lot of the maturity in my mind, and at that age that they brought from the Dragonlance books to like something entirely new.
Yeah. Yeah, those series for me, I've read some of them, but not the entire way through. There's lots of them.
Yeah,
That series is for me kind of very much in the vein of the 70s sci-fi fantasy books that would come out from Door or Tor or those sort of publishers, where it's not necessarily Jack Vance, but more like a Zelazny sort of like, hey, let's go all out. We're going to jump to different worlds. We're going to have,
yeah,
hapless heroes. We're going to have pretty, love interests. We'll have a dog. There's a lot of that stuff that goes on there. I think that's very much the vibe of Deathgate for me. The 80s were a weird time, obviously, because it wasn't even that long ago before that there was the 70s. But for us at the time, that felt like a lifetime ago. Oh my gosh, the 70s. And now
yeah.
it's like, the recycling retro aspect of it was very much not, we didn't get how recent it was. But even to this day, I know that Margaret's and many of the fans of Deathgate have wanted like an RPG based on it, but it's a weird holy grail for some gamers. I think is that they wanted to be in this the Deathgate cycle because for like you, they had such a blast playing reading it, and there really has not been sort of a campaign setting or
Yeah,
anything like that.
it's kind of strange, and I mean, not that there's anything wrong with Dragonlance. I enjoyed Dragonlance, but there was something about when I picked up that first one. It just Hugh the Hand, I think, was the name of the main character. That guy clicked with me somehow, and then suddenly
Mm.
the setting clicked with me. But what was neat is I think if I recall properly, they did 4 prequel books just to set up the 4 different worlds. Then they did the trilogy that they wanted to do afterwards. So I think there's a
Mhm.
total of at least 7 something books. But that
Yeah.
was like world building on a huge scale.
Yeah.
Let me ask you this. So I know that eventually you did end up authoring your own Dragonlance uh, uh, novel, the Sellsword.
Hmm. Yeah.
But is that the only book you've written as far as like a narratively driven? Am I missing? Did I miss a huge part of the
No,
research work?
I've written and had published one novel, which is that one.
It's
I've done a few short stories, but yeah.
it's so interesting to me because I just figured. So tell me about how did you end up writing it then? So I guess they came to you and asked, or did you say, "Hey, I've got an idea"? Or
Yeah, at the time, Wizards was doing a thing called Tracy Hickman Presents The Anvil of Time, which was going to be like a series of books that were written by, new authors or even sometimes established authors. But the whole idea was going back into time in the history of Dragonlance to fill in sort of gaps that were not, that people hadn't heard about, like almost like lost histories in a way, but also more sort of small scale, interesting, fun kind of snippets of time. And there was a linking character who was a historian who would come from the future of Dragonlance, go back in time using the Anvil of Time itself to sort of blend in and obviously always by accident interferes and everything and becomes pivotal to the entire storyline, right? Um, Margaret had come to me and said, like, we want to offer you the chance to write a novel because you obviously did such a great job on. She really, really liked Spectre of Sorrows, which was the second of the 3 big campaign modules for third edition. I had done a lot of work on that. She really liked it, and so she said, "Look, you have a talent for writing. I think you'd be good at doing this. Do a short story first. They want to see if you can do a short story." So I did a short story, and they all liked that a lot, and it got into a short story collection. So that was in one of those books. And then they said, "Okay, let's hear your pitches for how you want this to work." And I gave them like 3 different uh, ideas, and wrote up outlines for those, and they picked one and said this one looks like the most interesting, so go with it.
And were you excited to write it? Like, I have to ask because I feel like there are people that are going to sit down and they're going to write novels and they're going to write a whole bunch of novels. But you wrote the one. Was it something that you're like, oh, I just sort of told them, I gave them a pitch, now I got to write it? Or were you like happy to sit down and do something narrative based versus like a gazetteer or a
Yeah,
monster?
I really I wanted to tell a story, but I also knew that there was a story that I wanted to reveal. I didn't necessarily know the way it was going to completely come out. When I was writing it, I had an idea of the beginning, end, and everything else, but I just sort of explored it as I went through it there. The funny part was that the editor chopped out 20 pages of my Word document, and I didn't know where they all went. So clearly they weren't important parts of the book. I'm like, well, you did a good job. We cut this down to a really good size, and it's really good now. What's missing? And he's like, you don't need to know.
You
It's
don't
fine.
need.
You know,
There's a
you
lost cut out there somewhere.
yeah. So yeah. But afterwards, I was like, to my agent, I said, she's like, well, what do you want to do next? I'm like, I don't know. More books would be fine. But also, I was doing, RPG work, and that was a whole lot more fun at the time for me than sort of the stress of sitting down and writing a book solo, like that. So from time to time, I think I should go back and do more. My friend Jim Butcher, who is
Mm-hmm.
a novelist, he sent me he's really mad at me. He said, "Look, I had like six unpublished drafts that I submitted and didn't get published before I got my first one done, and you just go ahead and write one,
Right.
and it's great." And I said, well, I don't know if it's great, but I also know that the circumstances were entirely different. If someone had come to you with the same thing, probably would have been a similar outcome, right? Because he's a good writer.
Yeah.
But I think that the funny part about that was he's like, and what's next? And I'm like, I don't know. And I think he's more mad that I wasn't like, this is my future now. I'll be a novelist, and
Well, I think it's cool in a way. It makes me think of like this idea of, there are so many people that invest themselves, and I've taught students like this that 100%. Like when I teach students at the high school level and I teach creative writing, it's kind of like really fun. And it's really goofy. But then when you teach, and this is actually something that Stephen King kind of pointed out, when you teach someone that's in college creative writing, they're usually like, this is like a heartbreaking thing for them because usually if you're taking creative writing and you're, writing a novel or whatever, this is what you want to be your
mhm.
career. What's interesting
Yeah,
is you wrote your book, you seem happy with it. I know the fans are happy with it. And you're like, okay, well, I'll go back to what I
yeah.
have fun doing. And was there, you mentioned that it was stressful though. What was it like to sit down and just
Oh, deadlines are the worst.
yeah,
Like I had done about half of the book, and we were at this place that we would go to at the time, sort of like a week, 3, 4 days worth of relaxation before Gen Con. This was what we
hmm
did every year for Margaret's company. We would, because Gen Con was going to be just nonstop stress,
yeah,
just the vending and that whole experience. And so we would go somewhere and enjoy some great Southern cooking, and we would just hang out and just chill, and people would go off to things. I went to that thing, and I didn't haven't hadn't finished the book yet, and I knew I was about 60% written.
hmm
I wrote the other 40% over those 3 days, sitting in the dining hall of
right,
that place, writing on my computer. I didn't do any fun things anymore. I would take breaks. I would be done by dinner time, and then I would be over. So I would hang out by the fireplace and things. But I didn't do anything fun. I just wrote that stupid book for 3 days, finished it off. I was in a huge high because it was
yeah,
like this adrenaline thing.
mm.
Had a great convention, came home, and I'd already sent it off. I was like, yeah, and I just could forget about it for a couple months while the editors got, when Pat came around and said, I've got this, I'm going to edit this now. So, but I didn't want to repeat that stress to get that high again. Like it didn't seem like it was worth it. Right? I mean, at the time, it was great feeling like, oh, I've completed this thing, love
Yeah,
it. To this day, what happens now when I finish a book or project is done or sent to the press or anything else, I experienced what John Rogers, the screenwriter, calls rap flu. And when he was making the show Leverage, what would happen is that they'd wrap up a season and everyone would get sick because they were too busy doing the work and trying to hit deadlines and things throughout the season of writing, that once it was done, their body would go, okay, now you're done. We're going to get sick now because you haven't let us be sick. So I would get rap flu after each of these big projects and just essentially be sick for 2 or 3 days. Just, ugh,
That's what happens to animals you adopt from a lot of animals. It's funny that you say that because you start describing it, and I'm like, that's what happens. Like the animals when they're, at a shelter or something, even though they're, theoretically being cared for, they're also under an enormous amount of stress, and so they're like, they've got their hackles up for like weeks and sometimes, unfortunately, months or straight.
Yeah.
And then as soon as they get home to their, their permanent home, they get very sick, and it's because they've had their defenses up so much, and now their bodies are saying the same thing.
Yeah.
What do you attribute those? Was it the deadline that inspired you to write for 3 days straight, or did you honestly? Oh, it was that. Okay, so it wasn't like you had this. Oh, you're like, I got it now. I've cracked it.
No. It was like, and this happens to be too often than I want to admit. It's like, hey, this is due tomorrow. Well,
Right.
do an all-nighter.
There you go.
You'd think you'd learn after a while, but no, even, I'm 51 now, and I think that still is true for me. If you say, yeah, I've got 3 months to do a thing, I deliberately these days sketch out the way this is going to work into chunks, so I'm not doing the whole thing before it's due. But there are still points at which I'm like, oh, well, there's still a lot to do, and we're hitting the end of this thing. It's just let's go all out, and you do that whole crunch thing, which is not good for anybody. So I don't recommend it. But it is a reality of this product.
So, looking over your career and the places you've kind of been and all of that, I noticed that you were with, and I'm not exactly sure where you're at, not physically, but as far as working now, you were with Margaret Weiss's productions for like a long time through several different iterations. Can you tell us a little bit about? Obviously, you must have enjoyed it, or had a lot of fun there, or maybe just loved to swim around in Dragonlance all day long. What was it that kept you there for so long? And you're still obviously with them? I mean, Cortex is a different company, or it's licensed to a different company?
No, so interesting. So here's the way this worked out. Cortex kind of had its root in, first of all, there's a game called Sovereign Stone, which came out, before the millennium went over. But the real first Cortex game that anyone's familiar with, really, from Margaret Weiss Productions, is Serenity, which was based on the movie of Firefly, but not the show of Firefly, because there were 2 different licenses, right? So they did Serenity. It was incredibly successful. A lot of people loved it because at the time, everyone was a brown coat, whatever. I was busy doing a lot of Dragonlance for Margaret at the time. I'd been offered a job, and I moved to Wisconsin with my family. We moved to Wisconsin, which is where my wife comes from. So she was returning home, essentially, and that was great. From Pennsylvania to Wisconsin. Got a job there, no longer a contractor, no longer a freelancer. I was, an employee. So I worked on Dragonlance and wrapped that up while they were doing the Serenity stuff. Then they did Battlestar Galactica, which I didn't really do much work on, except sort of a lot of tinkering and editing and things. But I think it was Supernatural role-playing game, which I didn't write the design for, but I did a lot of the actual follow-up stuff, and then took on the guy who designed that. He left the company, and so then everything sort of fell to me to do all that, overseeing it. So we did supplements for Supernatural and Adventures and everything else. Then it came to this point where, okay, I was like, okay, what am I going to do now? What's the next license going to be? Let's figure this out. And that's when we got Smallville and Leverage. And so I completely rehashed Cortex to be something new. I called it Cortex Plus at the time, but it was just like a whole break it down to bits and restart it from the beginning, because a lot of the stuff that was in Serenity and Battlestar Galactica and Supernatural I didn't really like as much in terms of the mechanics. I wanted to get rid of that and put more stuff in. So I kind of became the Cortex guy then, right? Built on what had come prior to that, but essentially created a whole new way of doing it. And we did that. We um, did Marvel Heroic, and then near the end of that period of time, we picked up Firefly, which what Margaret really wanted to do because it was the one she couldn't do before because it was the license that wasn't available. So here we are doing this new version. It was my design and my Cortex, but I didn't write the book because um, I felt that someone who had a better handle of their voice of Firefly, who really liked the show, should do it. I've got a new job working at Atlas Games because we were now living in Minnesota, and my wife is working for Atlas as a proofreader, editor, and art director, and sort of doing reception duty as well, office management. And I got a job there as the RPG creative director. So that's when I moved away from Margaret's company and went to Atlas. So yeah, and when that happened, I kind of stopped Cortex. I wasn't with Cortex anymore. That was still with Margaret's company. There was a period of time when it was sort of in limbo. That I wasn't sure what they were going to do with it. They might have thought of doing new games, but nothing came out. And eventually, Margaret came back and said, "Look, you know, I don't want Cortex to die. You seem to know the most about it. How about you license it from us and do a Kickstarter and make whatever you want with it?" And that's kind of where that happened. So there's a huge Kickstarter, which was successful. Um, I had already spent a lot of time with Atlas making new stuff for them that was not Cortex. It was all, new versions, new editions of games they've already done. So Unknown Armies, Feng Shui, and some Ars Magica work. We had decided that we were going to move to New Zealand, by doing that, I couldn't work for Atlas anymore as their sort of full-time salary person. The Kickstarter had been successful, and I really, really was glad with that. But I essentially went back to New Zealand, and my only real job was doing that. And I kind of it went fallow for a bit. I was just struggling very hard with the move and the whole thing of just not having any other work. It was kind of a difficult period of time. What saved me and Cortex, I would say, is that Adam Bradford from Fandom, he's no longer with them, he's with Demiplane, but Adam brought me on to Fandom and said, look, we really want to do some games. We want to sort of go to tabletop. We want to sort of do the next big thing. So they outright bought all the rights for Cortex from Margaret. So Fandom now owns all of that. And that's, lock, stock, and barrel, doesn't matter. Not the licenses didn't come with because those are separate arrangements. But that's why right now we've got Cortex Prime, we've got Cortex games like Tales of Zadia. All of that has come out of them hiring me on as a creative director to do that. So I kind of picked up that work, and now I'm just going with it.
Can you tell us a little bit about? I'm actually really interested in. I'm not really sure what the technical term is, and I don't want to call them this, but I usually just say generic systems or open systems that are flexible. And can you tell us a little bit about what Cortex is and what it does?
Yeah, there are lots of generic systems. I'm a big fan of many of them, right? And I have been for a long time. I'm good friends with the folks who designed Fate, and I was part of their initial playtesting for Spirit of the Century and so on. So they're good friends of mine. I had several of them work with me on Leverage, for example, for Cortex. With Cortex, though, we soon found out after putting out these games that people were taking the rules and using them for their own settings. They were using it and hacking it and making new things with it. And we kind of felt that was kind of the direction that Cortex should eventually go, right? It should become a thing where you can, in your own, play group, sort of hack together different parts of it to do the things you want to do with it. It had never really been a thing where we were going to go open license, where it was just like, how Fate's OGL and the D20 OGL. That was never really the original intent, partly because there was some legal questions about the licensing and the people who were licensing partners with. It's a long story, but it was more like we really would love to make it easier for people to do this themselves, not necessarily for other publishers to make the stuff that does it. If that's a kind of a weird, fine line to walk. I still have people to this day who sort of, when they see a new game come out, their first question is, how can I make money off this game? And that's for me like the last thing I want to first do. I want to see, what's the game like? How does it play? Is it fun? Let's try it. Do that. Not like, oh, got a new game. I haven't even played it yet, but I want to know if I can make some money off this. That part to me seems like, first of all, you don't even know if the game's any good. You haven't really sort of like looked at the game and the people who designed it and put work into it to see whether it's any good. It's a weird thing to sort of be your first impulse. But on the other hand, there are lots of people who this is their work. This is how they make their living. They produce independent games. They put third party licenses. They'll do an adventure here and a supplement here, and that's how they make money. So I'm not sort of opposed to that because I was that person for a long time, but I also sort of want people to find that balance somehow in the appreciation of what people have done, including their own work, and then the feeling, okay, how do we take what we've got now and make something else out of it? So there are a lot of advanced ways to look at this, but I think the general thing with generic systems is it going to suit what you want to do with it? Does it fit? If it's like trying to put a square peg in a round hole, then probably not. It doesn't matter how open or free it is. If it's not going to work for that thing you want to do with it, then you shouldn't bother, right? And I guess the long and the short of it is, I think that with Cortex, I wanted to create something that was not just a sort of a generic system, but a toolkit to build games from. So it's the Lego set rather than it's the box of free Lego with tons of other stuff, pieces in it, and not just like a single kit that you can make things with.
So then what were the differences, maybe briefly, in the iterations between, what does that mean? You worked on, you took Cortex to Cortex Plus and then Cortex Plus to Cortex Prime. So that means you've worked on, or at least analyzed one and worked on developing the other two. What were the thoughts you had and the process you went through to convert one to the next to the next? Like, what were you trying to do each time, each iteration?
Well, with the original Cortex Classic stuff, it was more like, let's just do the game. Let's make the game, we would always fall back on the same stats and the same skills, essentially, and the same rules. It was just like, can we put a different setting on this and then rename things to make it work for that? For Cortex Plus, I felt that wasn't sufficient for the licenses we had. We couldn't just do that. I had to rebuild everything. The play experience had to be different. So I would break it down to the base level and rebuild it up and say, okay, for Smallville, it makes a lot of sense if we think about things in terms of your relationships and your values and what you believe as the driving heart of the mechanics and the dice you roll, as opposed to skills and attributes and gear. And for Leverage, it was like, what's your role in this group of thieves and con artists? Are you the mastermind? Are you the header? Do you have a little bit of both? If that's the case, then doesn't everybody have some of both? And so therefore that could be your stats. And then, for your secondary thing, just straight attributes. Maybe we have attributes as well. So that was the consideration for those games. For Plus was I wasn't thinking about, generic approach to it at all. I was thinking, can I use fundamentals of Cortex to make new games and then sort of have those games be kind of bespoke sort of games all on their own? It was only when we had people talking about how they were hacking them and doing other things with them, we said, okay, we could probably do more than that. We could make a generic game out of this, right? So that's sort of what we did. We sort of provided a book called the Cortex Plus Hacker's Guide, which was on Kickstarter. And the Hacker's Guide kind of was like, okay, so you could take Leverage or you can take Smallville or Marvel Heroic, which had just come out. And here are tons of different house rules for those two games. But because we can't use Smallville and Leverage names, we will call them Cortex Plus Drama and Cortex Plus Action.
Now I get it. Okay.
So that was just code for Smallville and Leverage. It wasn't like,
Yeah.
And then we had all these action mods and there's always drama mods, and it was really cool and lots of fun, and people had a good time contributing to that. And that's where, but those stuck, right? When we worked with Marvel as a licensor, we were told you can't just put Marvel on the thing. You have to have your own brand that Marvel is with, like how WizKids has HeroClix, It was Marvel Heroclix. Heroclix is your brand. Marvel is our brand. So they said, "What's your brand?" And I
Oh,
said, "Well, for us, I think heroic role playing is our brand, right? Let's do that." For Cortex, heroic role playing. They said, "Cool, that's good." So Marvel up here, heroic role playing down here. So it became Marvel Heroic Roleplaying. And for them, as far as licensing goes, Heroic Roleplaying was our brand, and that was there. So that became Cortex Plus Heroic, right? Because, that's what we're just going with this whole thing. There was never any real intention for there to be three versions of Cortex that were those three things that you would have to pick to make a new game. So when I did Firefly, I didn't take one of those three and just make a Firefly game using action or drama or heroic. I just built a Firefly game like I'd done previously. And I think that was the big confusion when it came to Prime. I'm like, I don't like these labels. People keep using them. I think it's not fair enough on the system itself. It could be way more. It could be a whole bunch of just mods that you could put together. So when it came time to thinking of what the Cortex Kickstarter was going to be about, it was, I want this completely backwards compatible book that has everything from all Cortex games ever done itemized and broken down and made generic and made sort of easy to slot together so that would become a toolkit. And that's what it was, right? Even classics Cortex is in there. So it's all the stuff prior to that. The intent was this will be the lingua franca, I guess, of Cortex from now on. If you make more stuff, you add to it. You don't just, ignore it and make a new one. So that's kind of where Tales of Xadia comes into it. That Tales of Xadia itself is built from pieces of Cortex Prime, and anything new that I made for it, we were going to put it back into Prime as a part of the pop.
right. It's interesting to me because if you so I had mentioned that there was a sort of period when I was out of RPGs for a while, and I think part of it was because I remember there were a lot of licenses that were kind of out there, and actually
Mm-hmm.
I had been part of the reason I was out was because I was kind of tired of dealing with licenses. I had worked at a movie studio for a while, and I was kind of sick of
Yeah.
all that stuff. But what was interesting to me is that I for years they're kind of like these things that just sat there, and I never thought about them. And then I started researching and finding out they got great acclaim. Like
Mm-hmm.
people were just raving about the systems, and people were just like, "This game shouldn't have been so good. How could it have been so good?" Like Smallville
Yeah.
and the
I
Fireflyers,
got I
right?
got that a lot. It's funny. Like, why did you spend so much time making this good game for something like Smallville, right? And I thought, well, look, it's fidelity to the property. You really have to do that. I mean, the IP is actually important. People love this stuff. You can't just half-ass it because if you do, the fans will know and tell that you just didn't care,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And for me, that's super important.
Well, it's interesting because it's transcended that. So now it's like it's not just the fans that know; it's everybody in the community that really knows that it's any good. And I kept researching and looking up reviews of the game, and like you're saying, time and again, it's like how is this game so good? What's going on here? And it was so interesting, and it made me go out, and I was like looking for that stuff, and I was really impressed by it. What if what was it like though when you sit down to work on Marvel Heroic Role Playing, and there are prior versions of the game, at least one of which is like legendary. Like, what is that
Yeah.
like to approach it? Like, are you nervous at all?
Oh yeah. Yeah. In that case, you're always standing on the shoulders of giants because the reach that the original Marvel game had can't be overstated, right? It was just everywhere. It had so many products put out for it. It was just it was the one of the licenses that of the time, right? I think probably the most popular licensed game of all time is Call of Cthulhu, and people still don't realize that's licensed. They don't realize that that's a licensed game. But well, smart people know because there's a novelist, right? But I think the thing with Marvel superheroes was that it was just there was so much content for it, and it was so in sync with what was being done in the comics. Like they put out a thing, oh, it's Secret Wars 2, we'll do a thing for that. Oh, this is coming out, we'll do a thing for that. So that's very good. So looking back on it, the Marvel Superheroes Adventure game was the card-based one that came out also from TSR, similar license arrangement, but that was near the end of TSR's existence, and it didn't get as much attention as it deserved. I think it was a pretty good game, but I like dice a lot more than cards for my games, and so that was like it. But looking back, what I wanted to do was I wanted to pay some respect to those games in terms of what was in Marvel Heroic. Some of the ideas that were in it were inspired by elements of the FASERIP sort of system and also the Marvel Superheroes Adventure game system. There's a thing called the Doom pool in Marvel Heroic, which is the growing pool of dice that the Watcher, GM, has as their sort of opposition dice. And the idea of the Doom pool kind of comes out of the idea that first of all, it took from a similar thing called the Trouble pool in Smallville, but the name Doom pool, there was a suit of the cards called Doom. So they had like different suits in the adventure game of the cards that you would play. And the Doom suit was one that always, if you played it, you could play it, you could use the points from it, but it would also bring something bad to the story. And likewise, when you sort of mess up in Marvel Heroic and roll a 1, the Watcher gets to buy that and put it in the Doom pool. And so over time, any of your failures and fumbles create more drama and tension in the story. So yeah, looking back, I mean, a lot of that was just like, how can I kind of represent some of what I really liked about those games, but without having to take the actual mechanics of it, but more the vibe, right? And the big takeaway from Marvel Superheroes was there were 3 ways of making characters in that game. One was you took a character that was already made for you, like Wolverine. The second one was you would model a character that you didn't have a character for. Like, say, if you didn't have Omega Red and you wanted to play him as a character, you said, okay, well, what's his powers? And you just put him together out of the bits. You didn't spend points or anything. You just made him, is modeling him. And the third one was random character creation, which was another fun part of playing Marvel Superheroes, making a character who was completely unplayable because he had a fatal allergy to violence and he could breathe underwater. You're like, whatever. Some of those characters were terrible. We ended up having all those 3 versions of characters in Marvel Heroic, and we still had people tell us that there was no character creation system in that game, which was just, to this day, so frustrating.
Well, I think what's interesting that you hit on there, and something that I sort of felt, is that it does, and this is something I think I had talked to Matt Forbeck about as well, was how do you do something different but keep it the same? And the interesting thing that you made there, it sounds like you're staying true to the spirit of it while changing the letter of it, and it's really true. Like, I got to be honest, I like the game and I like the system. And I remember, like, again, it was in that 10-something year period, 12-year period where I was out of games, and I was really regretting the fact that I didn't pick it up then, because now when you go back and you pick all these things up, you don't have the time to play them as much as you would like. But like, it's a very enjoyable, very fun game that really captures the mighty Marvel, feel, like the feel of it. It's a lot of fun to play. Well, let me ask you this: like, what are you working on now, and what are you excited about coming up?
Yeah, so not a lot of project in the future discussion. There's something that I don't normally talk about, things that haven't been announced yet or revealed yet. But I will say that we're really enjoying working on Tales of Xadia. That's been a really big deal for us. We launched it back in April, but we'd been working on it for a whole year prior to that. My day-to-day is a lot of it sounds boring, but it's like it's team coordination and sort of overseeing the production of things that are really important, but somehow no one ever gets to see, behind the scenes. But my design, I'm just really keen to work on, projects that sort of speak to the sort of stuff that we think the promise of Cortex has. So just getting it out there and making more stuff is the plan. Yeah, I mean, like it's just such a huge wild ride. I think any time you get to work with someone else's stuff and play in their sandbox, it's interesting. As far as like future stuff, like, just I want to make more games. I want to make more stuff with Cortex. I want to make, more of an impact to people and make it so that people enjoy these things and have a good time as an alternative to maybe what they thought was the only thing they could play.
Yeah, I enjoy that aspect. That's one of the reasons why I get into games like, Cortex or GURPS or Cipher System or there's a few others, more than a few others out there. I really like the idea of an assortment. It's like you wouldn't eat pizza 3 times a day for your whole life, and so I feel like
Hmm.
your reading and your enjoyment of life and your enjoyment of film and stories and all that should have a healthy variety diet to like a healthy nutritious diet, balance to
Yeah,
it. You know,
yeah.
what do you think? Maybe just as maybe a final kind of question here, and I don't mean to drop a huge question on you or anything, but what sort of impact do you think games have had on you designing? And maybe what do you think? How are you different as a person, or how are you better as a person, or any difference between Cam, who is the designer, and maybe who Cam might have been had he been gone into moderating between
Corporate annoyance people. Yeah, I feel that designing and playing and running games and having games, tabletop RPGs being a big part of my life has been really instrumental in sort of trying to find out what makes people the way they are, and sort of like what escapism means, what the value of play is, just understanding the things that people really need in the world and what you can do to sort of like find your place in it. Those are all some like big concepts, which is true, right? I mean, the people talk about these things all the time, but I feel that outside of the stress and anxiety of preparing for your game, like I was talking about before, honestly, I go into this bliss flow state when I'm playing in games. It achieves for me that moment of like, this is great. I'm having a good time. I'm just I'm doing it off the cuff. I very rarely follow exactly what any sort of published thing does. I'm just using that as my ground material. I fall back on rules that I know, and I always engage the players and have them lead the way, right? So there's a part of that just feels really good. And I think you can tell when you're not on a good day because it doesn't feel like that flow has hit you. But if you hit that moment, it's really, really great. And I think the same thing is true of people who walk off the stage and say that was the best performance that I've done in ages, and they don't remember how they do it. They just got into that flow. And the same, I think, is probably true for a lot of us when we play RPGs. If we're really having a good time, and not all the game is that way, some parts of it is like hurry up and have your turn, roll the dice,
Mm.
or the dice have been terrible to me all night. But there are moments where you think this transcends just this whole idea of pen and paper stuff. It becomes meaningful collaborative storytelling, and it's really great.
Well, I don't know how I could say anything after that. Cam, thank you so much for your time tonight. I've kept you entirely too long, but it's been great chatting with you. Um, I would say good luck in the future, but I already know that you're doing pretty darn well, and I think luck is not really much needed at this point.
I'll take it.
Well, there you go. There you go. At least, yes. I will. I will ask you as soon as we're off the air. I'm going to ask you for that horse's name. Hopefully, you'll be able to tell me. For those of you out there that have enjoyed our chat tonight, please do think about liking and subscribing to the channel. If you didn't like it, go ahead and subscribe anyway. Rage subscribe. Every subscription helps. You can come on here and criticize all you want. I'll just hit the little mute button so I don't hear from it, but you'll get a lot of your aggressions out. It's a wonderful, wonderful thing to do. Thank you so much for watching us. But in all seriousness, if you did enjoy the chat, please do think about maybe sharing the interview. I've got a lot of other ones here on the channel, and it's always great to get these voices out there. I really think that what they're doing, the RPG creators that I have on the program are doing some very important work. And some, I mean, adult play to me is like, as a teacher, I think it's a really important thing that a lot of us are, especially these days, are kind of forgetting about. You know, I think we think of play as something that you do when you're a child, but I really think there should be more play with and among adults. So please do think about liking, subscribing. Next week, on the 2nd, August 2nd, I'm going to be back with D20 Tales. Those folks are a lot of fun, so I do hope you'll join us. But until then, have a great game, and please stay safe, and thank you so much for watching.